While the first slaves were brought in from Portugal and Spain in 1513, most of the slaves of Hispaniola came from geographic areas where civilizations have been born and flourished in at least 38 regions and over 100 tribes in West Africa. Trained by hunger and thirst, locked day and night and reeking with the stinks of excrement, the slaves were held in position by the chains on their bleeding flesh. Thousands of slaves died from starvation during the passage to the island. Under harsh and degrading conditions, they worked and died, not only from the ferocity of violence, but from grief and rage and despair. In general, unsold slaves were killed or thrown into the sea. Those who survived the horror of the sea subsequently perished, some due to the island's tropical heat, humidity, and diseases. Some, so sick, terrified, and disheartened, died as a result of brutal treatment by the plantation owners. During the first days of arrival on the plantation, the slaves were purged, disinfected, and baptized as members of the Catholic Church. Then, with a hot iron, the slaves were branded on the chest or breast with the initial of their masters. For the slightest infractions, the slaves were also often tortured and whipped to death outright, all for the sadistic pleasure of their plantation owners. The tendencies of the plantation owners were to view the black slaves as persons who are by nature born to serve masters and as useful animals devoid of the slightest intelligence. Broken and terrorized into labor and submission, the slaves worked like animals and were housed like animals. By 1625, 125 years after the first slaves were brought to Hispaniola, the French began to settle in the northeast coast of the island, in Tortuga and in Port Margot. To Tortuga came fugitives from justice and men of all crimes and all nationalities. After nearly 205 years of Spanish domination and genocide, so began in 1697 a transition to a new breed of aggressors. By the Treaty of Ryswick, in order to settle their differences, Spain ceded the western part of Hispaniola to France. France had taken control of this new colony and changed its name to Saint-Domingue. From 1697 to 1803, Saint-Domingue was a society based on color and wealth. Racial and social tensions were widespread. By 1697, 60,000 whites and mulattoes, as well as 50,000 blacks and free slaves, inhabited the island. Mulattoes were the offspring of white plantation owners and black women slaves. The mulattoes regarded France as home and sent their children to France to be educated. The island at the time was also culturally separated by religion. The whites and mulattoes adopted Catholicism because of its integral part of the French culture, while voodoo remained the religion of choice of the black masses. The mulattoes thought of themselves superior to the blacks and stood more closely with the whites and the Catholic Church. Mulattoes and whites were united on one common ground, the maintenance of slavery. But all was not well. October 21st, 1790, embittered by the decree of the Black Code of 1789, which deprived them of their political rights, the mulattoes organized a revolt against the whites. The initial mulatto rebellion against the whites had brought up anxiety and fear and woke up the sleeping slaves. But soon thereafter, the whites and mulattoes made their peace rather than risk an uprising of the slaves holed up in the mountains. Those slaves were called the Maroons, men and women who would later become an essential key to the fight and survival of Haiti's independence. Pursued and harassed by mulattoes and whites, to escape persecution from practicing voodoo, and rather than work the fields, the maroon slaves fled the plantation and had taken off to the hills. By 1758, neglected and ignored by all, they had organized on their own and struck for freedom at last. Surrounded on every side by the rabid greed and violence of the mulattoes, Spaniards, British, and French, the slaves, those beasts of burden, had revolted. They revolted because they wanted to be free, free of hunger and human dignity. They aimed at the extermination of their oppressors,